What is the UN for today?
Mm.
What is it? What word are we trying to shape? Or what
Mm.
word is the UN trying to shape? And what role should UN play uh, in shaping it? Clearly, the UN need to refocus and focus on its primary core purpose, which
Right,
is
right.
which is maintenance of international peace and security. It should sort of uh, wind down those aspects of its work, wind down or reduce, which it cannot sustainably manage. By General Assembly could establish a peace and security review panel. The
Mm.
coercive power should rest with the Security Council. It should be able to, if it wishes to use its coercive power. But the notion of legitimacy would provide the General Assembly, due to its universal membership, as well as through this panel, to give more legitimacy to addressing problems of this nature. The world has changed, those metrics have changed, and the United Nations is stuck in the 20th century paradigm in terms of its human resources.
Mm.
UN should have a talent cloud,
Right.
not a career ladder. That's my point. And the future that I would request, if anyone were to see this interview, is to focus on the matrix that defines 21st century. And this is the only way which I believe the newcomers can obviously get into the United Nations. We need to see these reforms or as a solution, if not as a solution, as a way to recalibrate the UN's role. It's not minimizing the UN. When you think in these terms, some may think, "Oh, we have done so much. We be doing this." No, it's not a minimization or diminution of UN's role, but it should be seen as a renewal of United Nations, a renewal of the multilateralism. I am hopeful that the world will find its way back to multilateralism.
I have a great pleasure and honor to introduce my guest today, Ambassador Farrukh Khan, a very distinguished diplomat from Pakistan. He had a very distinguished career in Pakistan's foreign ministry, then also in the United Nations system. He had several key positions in the UN headquarters in New York, and now we are together, distinguished visiting scholars at Seton Hall University's School of Diplomacy and International Relations. It's very good to see you, Ambassador Farrukh. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Alisher. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Great. Thank you. Well, you spent many years working with UN and also within UN system. Of course, you have a great knowledge of the system. And I'd like to ask you a few questions. And let me start from the question about the biggest, the most important, significant challenges the United Nations system facing now. What are the UN, the biggest, the most important and significant challenges now?
UN's biggest challenges are nearly in every field. You take it from the standpoint of political challenges. The UN role is barely seen effective in the ongoing conflicts, let's say Ukraine or Gaza, Palestine issue, Sudan, everywhere. You find that the role United Nations is playing, there is a gap between those principles that the Charter espouses and the power politics that uh, comes to play with it. The Security Council, in particular, is handicapped. It is unable to uh, decide due to several interests. On the other hand, you also see that there are several challenges in the development area. So, the Sustainable Development Goals are not being met. The trajectory that we are on very clearly suggests that these goals are unlikely to be met by their deadline of 2030.
mm,
or at least even if the modicum of progress is there, it's not so great to be really think or be proud of. In the area of climate change, we see despite the presence of Paris Agreement, um, one that was negotiated painstakingly to replace the Kyoto Protocol, uh, the climate challenge is increasing. We have last year crossed 1.5 Celsius in terms of the spikes that were coming during last year. On the humanitarian side, you find that United Nations ability or resources, despite having institutional infrastructure, is again limited. Um, and the situation in Gaza, the situation in Ukraine, that there are so many flashpoints right now where UN's ability, partly also due to the availability of resources, is handicapped. And then when you look at humanitarian law or humanitarian human rights, the situation is not so different. So put simply, the challenges are everywhere
mm,
in all areas that United Nations has been operating. And it is very hard to find uh, how United Nations can pull itself up to deliver on some of the good results that is expected of an organization, and that is also part of the collective security, the world order that we constructed in the post 1945 era.
right. Yeah. You just delivered a series of lectures at Seton Hall about United Nations system and also reforms in the United Nations system. So I'd like to ask you about the reforms. Of course, there were a lot of talks about the reforms already for many years.
Hmm.
But in fact, we don't see much reforms there, it seems to me at least. So, what are the obstacles and what should be done in order to really reform the United Nations system to make it an effective, efficient international institution? And I know that you are writing a few articles, papers now about all these issues. Would you please to share with us some of your ideas about the reform?
Yeah. So, two points of proviso here. One is that UN is not an organization that has not done any reform. I think reforms, I should say, have been consistently undertaken at the United Nations level. Efficiency, decentralization, accountability. Oh, this has been a continuous process. So, a, the challenge that I see in all these reform efforts have been that these reforms have not been linked to the external environment in which the UN has been operating.
Mm,
So while there has been internal reform, the linkage with external environment has been missing. Secondly, at this stage, UN is also facing a serious financial crunch.
mm,
Resources are not only depleting, uh, but member states are not finding it useful for them to contribute to the United Nations. Um, so when you put this a picture in perspective, you have to ask yourself, um, what is it that the reforms should look at?
mm,
And what is it that the United Nations should be doing reform for?
mm,
Making the organization fit for 21st century. Yes, in principle, this is something that we should think about. But the core question that we need to ask ourselves is, um, what is the UN for today?
mm,
What is it? What world are we trying to shape? or what
mm,
world is the UN trying to shape, and what role should UN play uh, in shaping it? I
mm,
think these are the primary questions. And um, in that sense, um, the from my perspective, the United Nations should first ask itself whether reforms should be only about efficiency,
mm,
or is it about redefining its posture?
mm,
Um, and my view is that UN should, first of all, think about um, becoming a table or a platform where diverse actors come together, as opposed to an organization which is itself doing implementation. It should be an organization which is a convener, a facilitator of managing international affairs. Um, Secondly, um, it needs to focus on a purpose. Yes, there are many things that UN is supposed to be about. Article 101 talks about its role in peace and security. The same article talks about international humanitarian law or international humanitarian action, as well as human rights and economic development. But with the role or resources that UN has, what is its purpose?
mm.
And my view is that the clearly the UN need to refocus and focus on its primary core purpose, which
Right,
is
right.
which is maintenance of international peace and security. And in that sense, it should it should sort of uh, wind down those aspects of its work, wind down or reduce, which it cannot sustainably manage. Um, and if I were to conclude this argument, I would say that UN should focus on peace and security, strengthening its those instruments which are related to peace and security. For example, Department of Political and Peace Building Affairs. It should focus on conflict prevention. It should focus on preventive diplomacy. It should enhance its early warning system. This is where the resources should be deployed. Uh, Whereas those areas where you have multilateral system taking care of, for example, we are talking about development. There are multiple organizations. There are IFIs, there are regional organizations, there are regional member states organizations. So those should come forward. That's where UN act as a facilitator in focusing as a norm builder and facilitating the role in development. And in terms of peace and security, it should take refocus itself and try to devote more resources on the maintenance of international peace and security, because there is one thing that nobody else can do, and
Yeah,
that one thing is peace and security.
yeah,
And that is where the UN should focus. In all other areas, particularly development, it needs to reassess whether there are other actors in the multilateral system which are more capable, have more resources in order to deliver upon them, and act as a norm builder in the area of development. Yes, it should do climate change. There is no other organization which is managing. It should again focus on norm building, allowing other actors to help. It should do humanitarian work, because that is again where there is no other organization that can handle it.
right.
Of course.
Well, I fully agree with you. It's a very good idea, very promising, and a powerful idea, focusing on its key function, key role. And I remember you delivered this message also in your lecture, one of your lectures, and I fully support it. But how about the reforming of the Security Council? This is perhaps one of the most difficult issues. So, what should be done? Is it realistic, or we could wait another many decades or years to make really some reforms there?
Hmm. So, in terms of the Security Council in particular, um, as of today, we find that the it is by and far one of the most difficult issues to
Right.
reform the Security Council. And what is at stake here, in my view, is not just the question of reform or the liquidity crisis, but it's the question of a belief
Mm,
that whether humanity can solve problems collectively or not.
mm,
Now, in terms of Security Council, there has been many proposals,
right.
uh, but there are two issues which are at stake here. One of the issues, in my view, is the membership, and the other is the use and role of veto. How do we try and find a solution which resolves both of these aspects? Um, my As I look at different proposals from major interest group on the expansion of the council, for example, G4, which is Brazil, Germany, India, and Japan, or the African Union, they have their own proposal that 2 seats should be allocated to, or the Uniting for Consensus group, which says, well, there is no need for expansion in the permanent category or in giving veto to any new member. These are all maximalist positions, and
Mm,
none of the positions that these groups have is going to be leading us to any solution. Instead, I think a pathway could be a bit more layered, functional, which expands the legitimacy without directly threatening, let's say, the veto power of the existing P5, because we have not reached to a point where we can find a solution to it. Um, so this could be done in 2 steps, for example. One of the steps is to think about long-term, non-permanent seats,
mm,
temporary,
mm,
perhaps for 4-year term,
right.
without veto, uh, and 6 long-term, non-permanent seats, temporary, without veto, and with an ability for a renewable, that these seats should be renewed. Now, once we have solved this, that the expansion has happened, and this has happened before in 1965, obviously, the council was able to expand from to its existing 15 membership from 10 that existed earlier. Um, Now, this proposal, in my view, is in the realm of political stability. It's
Mm,
a structural adaptation to avoid political deadlock on permanent seats. It responds to the call for greater voice of the from the global south, and it will help at least creating that broad structure where different interests or different regions would be able to find voice within the decision making of the Security Council.
right.
The other aspect of this is the question of veto.
Mm,
How do you overcome the paralysis that happens in the Security Council? How do you overcome this? Um, e- the solution is not to take away veto. This is not where the word is. The solution is not to give veto, but at the same time, perhaps the solution to this could be strengthening the role of the General Assembly to come in support of the Council's decision on political
mm,
matters.
interesting. Yeah.
And to that end, I think by General Assembly could establish a peace and security review panel
Mm,
as a tier, as a perhaps as we can call it as a third tier. This body will could be obviously composed of regional groups or the membership, but not those who are sitting in the council, but separately. And the
mm,
role of this review panel is going to be or could be to issue non-binding recommendation when Security Council is unable or unwilling to act.
mm,
For example, Such non-binding recommendation could encourage diplomacy, propose consideration of mediation, maybe suggest that other preventive tools that are available in the United Nations, or with the role of the President of the General Assembly or the Security Council, could be, or in the very, more facilitative side of the United Nations, it could it could encourage diplomacy through regional groups, through
mm,
African Union, through European Union, through ASEAN, through others. But it will be non-binding recommendation. But this will at least allow a sizable number of other countries who are concerned about a particular situation, to be able to at least express their views and propose solutions that the Security Council is unable to produce. I have simultaneously thought about that in order for General Assembly to do this, we need to perhaps focus on creating within the General Assembly the ability to make such recommendations. For example, having a mediation panel at the disposal of the General Assembly. So sort of a roster. All it can do is to provide guidance to countries in situation that that mediation is available if they wish to do it on their own. So this could be a step towards a larger reform in the Security Council, which are not possible at this stage. So put
mm.
simply, you are able to expand Security Council from its current membership 15 to 21, let's say six seats long term, which is 4 years, renewable. So any member on that seat could also seek renewed term, which is not currently possible, without veto. And in order to facilitate when the Security Council is in paralysis, or in a situation where it cannot go overcome veto by a particular member, the General Assembly could play a role of issuing or giving non-binding recommendation through its Peace and Security Panel.
Well, that's very interesting. It's quite creative approach. But how about these weaknesses we're already facing? It's of non-binding recommendations. For example, General Assembly already issued many recommendations, resolutions, but since they are not binding, some of them are not very efficient. So, don't you afraid that this would be another just a recommendation without much effect?
So there are 2 points. Perhaps I was not clear in explaining this. The point here is that when General Assembly through its 193 members speaks, that is a lowest common denominator, because it's 193 members. Here in Peace and Security Review Panel, you're not talking about more than 10 members.
Hmm.
So the decision making is considerably, or the nature of those recommendations would be considerably different.
Right.
Um, in case of a paralysis in the Security Council that you have witnessed during better part of its history, I mean, um, there is no other tool available. Either the
Hmm.
countries have to take actions themselves, but at least in this format, you are able to provide some guidance that the United Nations is able to play through its General Assembly. I mean, let's be, it's important to understand the history of the General Assembly as well. Um, the first emergency mission, which was on Suez Canal, was created by the General Assembly, not by Security Council.
Hmm.
But during that time, the membership was 51.
Hmm.
Um, and in the post decolonization phase, as the countries continue to gain independence, the role of the General Assembly continued to shift from its larger picture that it was supposed to withhold as a universal body into towards more towards development, economic issues, so and lowest common denominator in all of them. We need to make sure, or at least I think, that General Assembly can play a prominent role, at least beyond what it is playing right now. And its role should also shift from global shift towards global peace and security and broad development issues, as opposed to being driven only on, let's say, sustainable development goals alone, or on the development side of the equation. It should be strengthened. We don't have a magic wand. We can't think that General Assembly would immediately become rivaled in meeting the role of the what Security Council does. But we should understand the difference between coercive power and legitimacy. The coercive power should rest with the Security Council. It should be able to, if it wishes to use its coercive power. But the notion of legitimacy would provide the General Assembly, due to its universal membership, as well as through this panel, to give more legitimacy to addressing problems of this nature.
Right. Yeah. Very, very interesting approach. Thank you. And, I've seen your very kind willingness to help students to get an internship in the United Nations, to engage with United Nations. That was very kind. And I'd like to ask you to give some advice to young people. It's well known that it's a very difficult to get a job in the United Nations. It's a very, very difficult. But what would be your advice as a person who knows the system so well? What would be your advice to young people how they could get a job there if they want, of course?
Mm. So I think there are two parts of this question. One is, of course, if you look at it from the standpoint of how the UN is structured, which has its career ladder, um, and if you look at it from today's standpoint, the question is whether a young person could get into United Nations. How? And there are ways. Of course, UN has young professional program that can be a kind of ladder or a building block to getting a contract for a position inside the UN. There is a route of internship. When you get into an internship, that also helps. The more important point that I want students to understand is in 1945, when the UN was made, what did the world look like? Or the world was kind of state-centric. Rules of conflict were defined by territorial wars, like there will be war on territories. Westphalian diplomacy, conducted in formal ways, closed rooms, back channel telegrams, in which the most of the ways that international affairs was conducted, or the problems were handled, were through tools of statecraft, which included armies, ambassadors, etc. Right? That is how it evolved. Over the years, it has changed, but that was the framework. In some ways, that framework persists. And I'll come to answering the questions more clearly once I make this clear what I'm saying. 21st century is not recognized by these metrics. The boundaries of conflict are no longer geographic.
Right.
These are digital, psychological, economic, and even climate. The actors are no longer just state, but there are also networks, platform, non-state actors,
Yeah.
AI-driven propaganda. I mean, who could say the question of Ukraine? You see how much of narrative warfare is going on.
Right.
The battlefields are no longer trenches, but they're like timelines. They're like on your screen, on a your iPhone, algorithms. There are cyber attacks. So the world has changed. Those metrics have changed, and the United Nations is stuck in the 20th century paradigm in terms of its human resources.
Hmm. Very interesting.
Now, what do we need to do? Um, I think what young people need to do is to focus themselves on becoming expert in the field that are relevant for the 21st century,
Mm.
and then becoming part of the United Nations, because then their contribution would matter.
Mm.
Of course, this involves changing many things. I mean, the UN itself has to structure itself from career trajectory and the word that was built for what I called tanks, treaties, and telegrams, and for tweets, tipping points, and trust deficit. UN itself has to structure. It should not be journalist. But I think that if students were to focus on not being a journalist who are looking for a career ladder, but becoming part of the global talent cloud, you
Mm.
know, UN should have a talent cloud,
Right.
not a career ladder. That's my point. And
Mm.
for students or for those who wish to become part of that, they need to not think about the career ladder, but they need to think about being part of the talent cloud.
Mm.
Those are the skills that will the United Nations would need. Those are the skills that they would need in order to contribute effectively for global problems. Otherwise, yes, at this stage, it is quite challenging with the resource constraint that the United Nations have, but it is possible. I do feel strongly, having served both inside the UN and outside the UN, that there is always a space for talented people to be recognized and their role to be integrated in the UN. And I hope, very much hope, and rather strongly hope that the ongoing reforms in the United Nations, particularly with respect to its internal bureaucracy, don't focus on shifting people from, let's say, New York to Geneva to Nairobi, or maybe retrenching some posts and distributing their work. No, the UN needs to simultaneously think about how it can become a convener, kind of a modular system, in which people come to solve problem together, not people come to live rest of their life in a job. UN needs to solve problems. UN does not need to provide long-term career trajectories. But the time has come for UN to be a force, a set of experienced diplomats or experienced multilateralists should be there, supported by people who know algorithms, codes, AI. All these people need to come together for UN to solve. And the future that I would request, if anyone were to see this interview, is to focus on the matrix that defines 21st century. And this is the only way which I believe the newcomers can obviously get into the United Nations.
Yeah. Well, perhaps this might be another very important dimension of the United Nations reform to bring all these young, talented people to engage with them, all these new kinds of working with those who want to contribute to the international development peace.
Mhm.
That's the whole new area which should be addressed now also in a new way. And I have a final question about more generally, not just about United Nations, but multilateral diplomacy, all
Mhm.
other international organizations. So, what do you think? What should be done now in order to make this whole multilateral diplomacy system in the world, all international organizations, institutions, to make them more efficient now? What should be done?
I'm, I mean, my perspective is obviously subjective in some sense. Um, but I do see that while I was writing about this um, in an article which I want to publish, there is no doubt that the world still needs the United Nations and its role in multilateralism. But today, the UN is at a place where nobody waits for it. You know, there is no one going running around to the United Nations trying to solve those problems. Um, what we are looking at a word which is more contested, which is more fragmented. It is fast moving, and it it is asking the United Nations or the multilateralism as a whole, can the UN be able to resurrect the multilateralism or not? This is the word which is very different from the word that we all inherited when we were growing up. My answer to this question, when I look at this picture, is that the answer to this does not lie in doing more with less, but doing what matters most. And this requires a very clear strategic purpose right now to resurrect multilateralism. That is to retreat from roles that UN has developed for itself over the past 8 decades and refocus itself to something that it can really deliver. And again, I come back to this issue. By focusing on peace and security as its primary function and winding down its role from other areas that it cannot sustainably fulfill. We know the financial situation of the UN is not going to improve anytime soon. Even if it were to improve, it is not going to improve anytime soon. So the long and short of this is UN cannot continue to do what it has been doing. So we need to decide what can the UN do. And we need to see these reforms or as a solution, if not as a solution, as a way to recalibrate the UN's role. It's not minimizing the UN. When you think in these terms, some may think, oh, we have done so much, should we be doing this? No, it's not a minimization or diminution of UN's role, but it should be seen as a renewal of United Nations, a renewal of the multilateralism. We need to think about a generational recalibration that restores its authority, restores its purpose, and allows the organization to reshape global cooperation for the next century, not for the century behind, or not. So this multilateralism would require UN to play a very important role, an exceedingly important role. UN should be that table on which everyone comes together. Everyone comes together and decide this is how we need to support engage, promote, and find solutions. And then, uh, barring aside peace and security, in which the UN should take the lead role, in all other areas, the entities of the multilateral system, IFIs, development finance institutions, etc., they should come forward and go into implementation.
Right. Well, it's a very challenging time for multilateralism, as we see. And are you optimistic about multilateral diplomacy?
Hmm. Um, so this is an age where globalization or multilateralism is under assault. Um, the assault is coming from various factors, and one of the factors that I see is the rising nationalism, where and this rise in nationalism just an is not just some political parties coming together and thinking about it. This is a reaction to globalization, because in globalization, while many found opportunities, there were many who lost.
Mm,
There are many who, for whom multilateralism, globalization has been a source of dislocation, not opportunity. And for that to change, the UN's role as a body of multilateral system not only need to refocus itself on its primary function, which I keep repeating so that it's clear as to how the purpose is defined. I believe that UN's role, from my perspective, is quite optimistic. If we are able to construct or reconstruct or redefine or recalibrate its purpose towards what it needs to do. Right now, the agenda is diffused. You are
mm,
doing everything, but not to a point where you can achieve anything.
right.
And that role obviously is seen by everyone. You would recall during some of my conversations or lectures, I asked the students, what do they think of United Nations?
Mm,
And a very clear answer was that the young generation is not hopeful
mm,
of the role of the UN. If that impression persists at the level where the young generation do not find it very effective, uh, that is something needs to be changed. UN has a role to play which nobody else can play. Multilateralism is important because the word, no matter what we do, is not going to become state-centric anymore. It's not going to be that Westphalian world that we know of. There are no boundaries in this world. There are, um, um, of course, there are still borders, uh, but a code can penetrate, a virus can penetrate, a danger like pandemic can penetrate from one corner of the world to another, as we saw during the pandemic. There are no borders, more or less, in this world. While, of course, one can say, except movement of people through
mm,
immigration or otherwise, there are no other borders left. And uh, humanity cannot continue, or humanity cannot retreat itself in 20th century state-centric model and think that it can solve. It has to
mm,
come together. And it has to find that balance where multilateralism is again seen as the way forward for humanity to come together and solve problems. So in that sense, giving the situation, I am hopeful that the world will find its way back to multilateralism.
Ambassador Farrukh Khan, thank you so much for your time and for your sharing with us your some very interesting ideas. And you are combining two very important skills. One is practical skills, and second is reflection skills. It's very good to see in diplomats this combination. And for the viewers, you could find more information about Ambassador in the description. And I wish you all the best. Thank you very much again for your time.
Thank you for having me, Alisher. Thank you.